She stood in a courtroom packed with ranchers and railroad men holding two documents that could save a valley or destroy her family. She was not a lawyer. She was a seamstress from Boston who had arrived in Colorado 8 weeks earlier with nothing but a battered trunk and a letter from a man she had never met. And now three mountain brothers, a corrupt judge, and the future of every ranch in the territory were waiting for her to speak. This is how it started. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just a dirt street in a town that looked like it had been nailed together in a hurry and forgotten about ever since. And across that street, standing near the livery stable like three pillars carved from the same mountain, were the men. Three of them. The letter had said, "We." Clara Whitfield had read that word 100 times during 3 weeks of rattling westward in a coach that smelled like old leather and other people's exhaustion. She had assumed the "we" was a formality, a man and his ranch, a homestead that needed a woman's hands. She had not assumed the "we" meant three men who looked like they could carry the stagecoach on their shoulders and still have breath left over. The tallest one stood slightly apart from the other, two hat in his hands, dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that gave away nothing, absolutely nothing. He could have been carved from the same granite that formed the peaks behind him. The second one leaned against a post with his arms crossed and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, watching her with the kind of expression a man wears when he has already decided something is a bad idea but showed up anyway. The third, the youngest, had fair hair falling across his forehead and warm brown eyes and was the first to spot her. He straightened, nudged the scarred one, pointed. All three turned to look at Clara Whitfield. She looked back. Her first thought was clear and cold. There are three of them. Her second thought followed like a shadow. The letter said, "We," and I chose not to ask what that meant. Her third thought arrived with the particular calm of a woman who has survived worse than surprise. "I have nowhere else to go, so I had better stand up straight." She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and waited. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. Now settle in, because what happens next will break your heart wide open and put it back together again. 3 weeks earlier, Clara Whitfield had been sitting on a narrow bed in a Boston boarding house, holding a letter she had read so many times the creases had worn thin as onion skin. The room smelled like damp wool and coal smoke, and the particular staleness of a life going nowhere. She shared it with three other women who worked at the Pemberton textile mill, though worked was a generous word for what the mill demanded. 12 hours a day feeding fabric through machines that could take a finger as easily as a seam. 6 years she had done this. 6 years since her father died and left her with nothing but a carpenter's vocabulary and a hunger for books she could not afford to buy. Her mother had died before that. Consumption. Clara remembered the sound of it more than anything. The coughing that went on for months until it didn't, and then the silence was worse. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been a carpenter by trade and a teacher by temperament. He taught Clara to read before she could tie her shoes. He taught her to measure twice and cut once, to look at a broken thing and see the structure underneath, to trust her eyes more than other people's words. When he died, he left her nothing but those lessons and a pair of reading spectacles she kept in her trunk like a relic. The letter in her hands was a response to an advertisement she had answered in the Matrimonial Times. The advertisement had been different from the others. While most listings sought a comely young woman of pleasant disposition or a fair maiden of good breeding and gentle nature, this one had been blunt as a hammer strike. Three brothers seek a capable, virtuous woman for marriage and homestead partnership in the Colorado mountains. Must be willing to work hard and endure isolation. Character valued above all else. Character valued above all else. Clara had read those 4 words and felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope exactly, something more fragile than hope, but more useful. Possibility. She had answered the advertisement the same day. 3 weeks later, the reply arrived in a firm spare hand that wasted no words. "Miss Whitfield, we accept your application. Enclosed is fare for passage to Silver Falls, Colorado territory. Present yourself at the Silver Falls General Store on October 15th. You will be met. Be prepared for hard country and honest work. T. Mercer, Three Peaks Ranch." She had memorized every word, every ink stroke, every place where the pen pressed harder, suggesting either emphasis or simply a heavy hand. She knew nothing about C. Mercer except that he valued capability over beauty, honesty over flattery, and directness over charm. This was why she trusted the letter. In a world that had valued none of those things in Clara Whitfield, someone finally seemed to want exactly what she was. She did not yet know why she had needed to leave Boston so urgently. Or rather, she knew, but she did not like to think about it. The factory owner's son. His name was Gerald Pemberton, and he had cornered her in the supply room on a Tuesday afternoon in August when the machines were loud enough to cover any sound a woman might make. He was drunk. He was heavy. His hands grabbed at her bodice with the entitled clumsiness of a man who had never been told no. Clara told him no. He did not listen. She reached behind her without looking and found the shears. Heavy industrial, sharp enough to cut through 3 layers of canvas. She drove them into his forearm, and the sound he made was high and thin, and surprised like a bush that had been kicked for the first time by a master it trusted. Blood ran down his wrist and onto the storeroom floor, and Clara stood there with the shears in her hand and her own hands absolutely steady. She was fired the next morning. The owner called her a liar and worse. She was blacklisted from every factory in Boston. No mill would hire the woman who had stabbed Gerald Pemberton, never mind what Gerald Pemberton had been doing when she stabbed him. The boarding house gave her 2 weeks. The streets gave her nothing at all. And then the advertisement. And then the letter. And then 3 weeks in a stagecoach, watching the world change from gray stone and crowded streets to something so vast and wild and open that it made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name. The stagecoach had climbed into mountains she had never imagined. The air grew thinner, cleaner, colder. Pine trees rose like cathedral columns, their bark rough and red, their needles releasing a scent that Clara breathed in like medicine. The sky above them was so blue it hurt. In Boston, the sky was a narrow strip between rooftops the color of old dishwater. Here it was everything. It went on forever. It made her feel small and free at the same time, and she was not sure which feeling frightened her more. Now she stood on the boardwalk in Silver Falls trunk at her feet and watched the 3 Mercer brothers cross the street toward her. The eldest reached her first. Up close, he was even more imposing. 6.5 feet of work, hardened muscle and silence. His eyes were amber, the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, and they held a stillness that could have been peace or could have been emptiness. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair cropped short, and the motion was deliberate, respectful, the gesture of a man who had been raised to show courtesy even when he no longer felt much of anything. Miss Whitfield, his voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry weight. It moved through the noise of the street like a river cutting through rock. Quietly, inevitably. Mr. Mercer, Corbin Mercer. He said his name the same way he might offer a hammer. Something useful, nothing more. These are my brothers, Boone and Silas. The scarred one, Boone, gave a nod so brief it barely qualified as acknowledgement. His eyes moved over her the way a man checks a fence line looking for weaknesses, gaps, places where something might break through. Whatever he found, his expression did not change. It remained fixed in a position somewhere between skepticism and resignation. Silas, the youngest, smiled. It was the kind of smile that changed everything about a face, turning weather-beaten angles into something warm and approachable and almost boyish. "Welcome to Colorado, Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice carried genuine warmth. "How was the journey? Long?" Clara paused. Then, because she had learned that the only way to survive surprise was to meet it head-on. The advertisement mentioned 1 marriage, it did not mention 3 men. The silence that followed was the loudest thing on that street. A horse snorted at the hitching post. Somewhere down the boardwalk, a door slammed. But between the 4 of them, the air went absolutely still. Corbin's jaw tightened. Boone made a sound that was half snort, half vindication, the exhale of a man whose worst predictions have just been confirmed. Silas looked at his boots. "The marriage is with me, Corbin said, his voice unchanged, still low, still steady. "My brothers live and work on the ranch. It is a family operation." "You might have mentioned that in the letter." "Would you have come?" Clara considered this honestly. She thought about the boarding house, the closed doors, the empty rooms, the slow suffocation of a life without possibility. She thought about Gerald Pemberton's hands and the weight of the shears and the sound of her own steadiness in a moment when steadiness was all she had. "I do not know," she said, "but I would have appreciated the choice." "You still have a choice." Corbin's amber eyes held hers without wavering. "If you want to get back on that stage, I will pay your fare home. No obligation, no questions." For a long moment, Clara looked at the stagecoach. Still loading at the depot, the driver watering his horses. She could go back. Back to Boston. Back to nothing. She turned to Corbin Mercer. "I will stay, but I want to see the ranch first. And I want to understand exactly what I am agreeing to before anything is made legal." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A hairline fracture in the granite, surprise maybe, or the faintest ghost of respect. "Fair enough," he said. Boone muttered something under his breath that sounded like city girl, but was not quite loud enough to be worth a confrontation. Silas shouldered Clara's trunk like it weighed nothing and grinned. "Wagon is this way. Half a day's ride. You will want to hold on. The road gets interesting." The road to Three Peaks Ranch climbed out of Silver Falls and into country that made everything Clara had ever known seem small and temporary. The town fell away behind them, replaced by slopes thick with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir trees, so tall their tops vanished into a sky that seemed to go on forever. The air smelled like resin and cold water, and earth that had never been turned by a plow. Elk Creek ran alongside the trail for the first mile, its water so clear that Clara could see every stone on the bottom, every shadow where trout held steady against the current. She sat on the wagon bench beside Corbin, and there was exactly 1 foot of space between them. She noticed this because she noticed everything. It was the space a careful man leaves a man who wants a woman to know she is safe without having to say it out loud. Corbin drove with his eyes on the road and his words rationed like winter supplies. He answered Clara's questions with facts. 1,200 acres, 30 head of cattle down from 60 at the ranch's peak. 1 milk cow, chickens, a well with a stubborn pump. 3 hours from the nearest neighbor, half a day from town. The kind of isolation that either makes a person stronger or breaks them entirely. He did not volunteer information about himself. Clara had to read it from the details. The pale line on his left ring finger where a wedding band used to be. The way his hands held the reins with unconscious expertise, fingers scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had built his world from raw timber and willpower. The way his eyes sometimes went distant between sentences, traveling to a place she could not follow. Boone rode alongside on a steel-gray gelding that was the healthiest, best-kept animal Clara had seen since leaving Boston. The horse was brushed to a shine, its mane braided, its tack oiled and supple. Whatever Boone's feelings about the rest of the world, he loved that horse. Clara noticed and stored it. A man who cares for his animals is not all bad, no matter how hard he works to seem otherwise. Silas rode on the other side and filled the silence the way sunlight fills a room. He pointed out landmarks with the unself-conscious affection of a man showing off his home. A waterfall visible through the trees, its spray catching rainbows in the afternoon light. A meadow where elk grazed in spring, their calves wobbling on new legs. A ridge where on a clear day, you could see the 3 peaks that gave the ranch its name: Eagle Peak, Sentinel, and Old Woman Mountain. He talked about the valley the way some people talk about family with deep, unguarded love. About 2 hours into the ride, Clara asked the question she could not hold back any longer. "Why a mail-order bride? There must be women in Silver Falls." The brothers exchanged glances. A rapid, wordless communication that told Clara they were deeply bonded even when they did not agree. 3 sets of eyes meeting and meeting again, carrying entire conversations in fractions of seconds. Silas spoke first. "There are not many women out here. The ones who already have families. Or they are not interested in a ranch 3 hours from town in a valley that gets snowed in 4 months of the year." "We tried hiring help," Corbin added, his eyes on the road. "Twice. First one lasted 2 weeks. Second lasted 3 days. What happened to them? They left, too isolated, too much work, too far from anything they recognized." "And you think a wife will not leave? A wife has a stake in the place." The voice came from Boone, his first voluntary contribution. He did not look at Clara when he said it. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, the scar on his face catching the light. A hired woman can walk away whenever she wants. A wife is bound. Clara's spine went rigid. One word landed between them like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples in every direction. Bound. I heard you, she said, and her voice was quiet but carried the way a blade carries, not loud, just sharp. And I want to be clear about something, Mr. Mercer. I am not coming to this ranch to be bound to anything. I am coming to see if this is a place where I can build a life. If it is, I stay by choice. If it is not, no piece of paper will keep me here. The tension between them crackled like dry lightning on a summer ridge. Boone's hands tightened on the reins. His horse felt it and tossed its head. Then Corbin spoke quiet but absolute, the voice of a man who has settled arguments between these two brothers 1,000 times before. Nobody is binding anybody to anything. She will see the ranch, she will see the work, she will disarm, that is the deal. Boone turned his horse and rode ahead, putting distance between himself and the conversation, like a man retreating from a fire he started and could not control. Silas caught Clara's eye from horseback and offered a small, apologetic expression. He is not as bad as he seems, he said quietly. How bad is he? About half as bad. Give him time. She was building a catalog the way she once cataloged patterns at the factory. Corbin, grief, duty, stillness. Boone, Yerkini, loyalty. Fear disguised as hostility. Silas, warmth, perception. The quiet glue that held the rest together. Three brothers, three pieces of something that had once been whole and was now held together by habit and stubbornness in the land itself. The ranch came into view as the trail opened into a wide valley cradled between the three peaks. Elk Creek wound through the center like a silver ribbon, its banks lined with cottonwoods turning gold with autumn. The light was different here, warmer, softer, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like it belonged in a painting, which only made the condition of the ranch more painful to see. The house was log-built solid with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged at one corner like a tired man leaning on a cane. The barn was larger, but patched in places with mismatched wood repairs, made hastily and without care. Fences ran in lines that spoke of ambition but lacked maintenance. Rails missing, posts leaning, gates hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Cattle dotted the far pasture, 30 head or so, looking thin and restless. A chicken coop stood near the house with its door hanging by one hinge. A vegetable garden had gone completely to weeds, the skeletal remains of tomato stakes poking up like grave markers. Everything spoke of a place that had been built with love and maintained with pride, and then at some point abandoned to the slow erosion of a grief too heavy to carry and too permanent to put down. Corbin pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. He sat for a moment looking at his own property, the way a man looks at a wound he has been trying to ignore. Then he said quietly, the way he said most things, "It is not much. Used to be better." Clara climbed down before he could help her. She stood in the yard, her traveling dress dusty, her hair escaping its pins, and she looked at the ranch with the focused, methodical attention of someone taking inventory. She saw what was broken. She saw what could be saved. She saw the bones of the place underneath the neglect, the way her father had taught her to see the bones of a house beneath peeling paint and sagging floors. "It has bones," she said finally. "Good bones." Corbin looked at her, and surprise broke through his carefully maintained blankness like sunlight through a crack in a door. For just a moment, he was not a man encased in grief. He was a man who had heard something unexpected, something that contradicted the story he had been telling himself about his own failure, and did not know what to do with it. "My father was a carpenter," Clara said, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "He taught me the difference between broken and ruined. This place is broken. Broken can be fixed." Something loosened in Corbin's chest, just a fraction, barely visible, but Silas, dismounting nearby, saw it and hid a small smile behind the motion of unsaddling his horse. Boone said nothing, but the rigid skepticism in his posture shifted towards something less certain. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first faint tremor of doubt in his own conviction that this woman was a mistake. Inside the house smelled like wood smoke and old coffee and the particular staleness of a place where a man has been surviving rather than living. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, and shelves that were mostly empty. Dust covered everything in a thin democratic layer. Through one doorway, Clara could see a small bedroom. Through another, what might have been a pantry, once now cluttered with tools and gear that had no other home. "This room is yours," Corbin said, nodding toward the bedroom. It was spare, a bed made with military precision, bare hooks on the wall where dresses once hung, a faded rectangle on the plaster where a mirror used to be. The room of a woman who was no longer there, emptied of everything but the shape of her absence. "I will take the loft." He indicated a ladder in the corner leading up to a sleeping platform under the eaves. "Where do your brothers sleep?" "Boone has the bunkhouse out back. Silas sleeps in the barn loft. His choice. He says he likes being near the animals." Something crossed Corbin's face. Not quite warmth, but the memory of warmth. The ghost of a time when that detail about his youngest brother made him smile instead of simply registering as fact. Clara stood in the center of the room with her hands resting on the back of a chair, and she said what she needed to say because uncertainty was a luxury she had never been able to afford. "I need to know the rules, how this works, who does what you expect from me, and what I can expect from you." Corbin explained. He was up before dawn, cattle fencing heavy labor. Boone handled the horses and security rode the perimeter, kept watch when there was trouble. Silas tended the animals' chickens, milk cow dogs, horses that needed gentling. If Clara could manage the house, the cooking, the cleaning, the mending, the garden, if she could bring it back the account books that had not been properly kept in 2 years, that would be more help than she could know. "And the marriage?" Clara asked. The word hung in the air between them like a held breath. Corbin's jaw tightened, and Clara watched the muscles work beneath the stubble, saw the effort it cost him to hold himself together around a subject that clearly cut close to bone. "We will wait," he said, "as long as you need, until you are sure. I will not push. And if I am never sure, then you have a home and honest work, and nobody will trouble you about it." She studied him for a long moment. She saw grief in the lines around his eyes, exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, and beneath all of it, buried so deep it was almost invisible, a flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation wearing hope's face. "All right," she said. "I will try now. That is all I ask." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Miss Whitfield, Clara." The use of her first name startled them both. He said it like a man testing unfamiliar ground, not sure whether it would hold his weight. "Thank you for coming, for staying, whatever happens. Do not thank me yet, Mr. Mercer. You have not tasted my cooking." The faintest ghost of a smile touched his mouth. It lasted half a second. It changed his entire face. For that half second, Clara saw the man he must have been before the grief. Handsome, alive, capable of joy. And then it was gone, and he was granite again. "Corbin," he said, "if we are doing this, it is Corbin." "Corbin, then." He nodded and was gone. Clara stood alone in the room that was now hers by law and circumstance and desperation. And she breathed, just breathed, took in the silence, the space, the fact that no one was watching her, judging her, reaching for her with hands she had not invited. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She started before dawn the next morning, rising to find that Corbin had already lit the fire and left coffee warming on the stove. A small act of consideration from a man who could barely hold himself together, remembering to leave coffee for a woman he had known for less than a day. Clara drank it standing at the window watching the mountains turn gold with sunrise, and she stored this detail in the growing catalog of things she was learning about Corbin Mercer. He was not empty, he was buried. And buried things could be dug up if you had the patience and the right tools. She attacked the house with the methodical intensity of someone who had been idle too long and needed to prove to herself and to the universe that she was worth the space she occupied. She scrubbed the dishes, crusted plates, and cups piled in a basin's evidence of weeks of a man eating alone and caring only enough to keep himself breathing. She pumped water from the well, heated it over the fire, and scrubbed until her hands were red and the tin plates gleamed. She swept the floors. She scoured the planks with lye soap she found under the basin. She wiped the windows until light poured in, clear and bright, transforming the dim, neglected space into something that felt almost hopeful. She found flour in the pantry, checked it for weevils, picked them out, said nothing, and made biscuits. On the third day, she tackled the garden. It was a disaster. Weeks of neglect had turned what was clearly once a productive plot into a tangle of weeds and dead plants and hard-packed earth. Sarah's garden, she realized. Another thing that died with her. Clara knelt in the dirt in her work dress and dug with her bare hands until she found a forgotten trowel half buried near the fence. She worked for hours pulling weeds, turning soil, clearing beds, her back aching and her fingers raw, and her mind perfectly mercifully focused on something she could fix. Silas found her there at midday, offered water, offered help. She handed him the trowel and they worked side by side through the afternoon without needing many words. By evening, the garden was cleared, turned and planted with late-season seeds she found in a tin kale turnips, winter radishes. Almost certainly too late for a full harvest, but something would grow. And the act of planting felt like a declaration she was not ready to say out loud, but needed to make with her hands. I am staying, I am building. When Corbin saw the garden that evening, he stopped at the fence and stared. Clara watched from the kitchen window and saw his face, and what she saw there made her grip the edge of the counter. He was seeing Sarah's garden reborn. The grief and the gratitude and the confusion of it were all there, naked and unguarded for just a moment, before he composed himself and walked away. She did not follow. Some grief needs space. But she stored the image, and she thought, he is not dead inside. He is just afraid to feel. And she thought, I can work with afraid. The quilt changed everything. She found it on the fifth day, buried at the bottom of a cedar chest, folded beneath old linens that smelled of lavender and thyme. It was hand-stitched, faded from what must have been vivid colors to soft, muted tones, but still beautiful. Every stitch placed with care. Every pattern chosen with intention. The work of a woman who made things to be loved. Clara hung it in the sun to air, and when Corbin came in from the fields that evening and saw it draped over the porch rail, catching the last amber light of sunset, he stopped so suddenly that Silas nearly walked into his back. That was hers, Corbin said quietly, and the words cost him something visible. His voice, usually so controlled, cracked around the edges like ice under pressure. Sarah made it the first winter we were married. I packed it away after. I could not look at it. Clara's hands stilled on the fabric. I can put it back. No. He reached out and his fingers brushed the stitches, tracing a pattern that his wife's hands had created in a world that no longer existed. She would have hated it locked away. She made things to be used. He looked at Clara, and his eyes were full of a pain so old it had become part of his architecture. Keep it, please. So she did. That night, she slept under the quilt and felt the ghost of another woman's hands in every stitch. Not haunting, present. A reminder that love had lived here once, in this house, in this room, under this same roof of log and stone. And maybe if they were careful, it could live here again. Boone's resistance was the sharpest edge in those first days. He was not cruel. Clara would say that later when people asked, and she would mean it. He was never cruel. But he was relentless in his skepticism, constant in his testing, tireless in his determination to prove that this arrangement was a mistake. He left his boots muddy on the floor Clara had just scrubbed. He came to meals late, ate without comment, and left without thanks. He watched her work with narrowed eyes, waiting for her to fail to complain, to prove herself as soft and temporary as he had decided she was. Clara did not engage. She did not argue, did not complain, did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She had survived Gerald Pemberton in 6 years of factory work and the systematic erasure of being nobody in a city of thousands. She could survive one angry man with a scar and a grudge against change. She simply outlasted him, worked harder, stayed later, produced results that were impossible to ignore. The turning point came on the 5th day. Boone returned from riding the fence line to find that Clara had mended his spare shirt, the one he had left on a chair with a torn sleeve tossed there the way a man tosses things when he has given up on anyone caring enough to notice. Clara had noticed. She had mended it without being asked, and the stitching was flawless. Professional. Better than new. He held the shirt in his calloused hands, turning it over, running his thumb along the seam where the tear had been. His face did something complicated, not softening, cracking. The way stone cracks when water seeps in and freezes and expands, breaking apart something that seemed permanent. That evening, for the first time, he said thank you after dinner. One word spoken quietly, almost grudgingly, as if it had been dragged out of him by forces he did not understand and could not resist. Clara heard it. Silas heard it. Corbin at the other end of the table heard it, and looked at his brother with an expression that was very close to wonder. On the 8th day, trouble came riding into the valley. Clara was hanging laundry in the yard, her arms full of damp cloth, when she saw the riders. 3 of them approaching from the south trail. The lead rider sat a black horse and wore a suit that had no business being on a mountain trail. The 2 men flanking him rested their hands on holstered pistols with the casual ease of professionals. Something about the way they moved set every instinct in Clara's body humming. The same instincts that had warned her about Gerald Pemberton moments before he struck. The same instincts that had guided her hand to the shears. She walked toward the house, not running, not dawdling, moving with the purposeful calm of a woman who has learned to trust the alarm bells in her own body. The man in the suit dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who spent more time in offices than saddles, but wanted you to think otherwise. He was clean-shaven, perhaps 40, with the kind of smile that stopped at his teeth and never went further. "Good morning, ma'am. Preston Hale, representing the Trans Mountain Railroad Company. Is Mr. Mercer available?" Corbin emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Boone appeared from the tree line where he had been riding patrol, materializing on his gray gelding like a ghost made of muscle and bad intentions. Silas came from the corral, a bridle in one hand, his warm face suddenly very still. 3 brothers. 3 walls closing around their property. Hale's smile did not waver, but Clara saw something flicker behind his eyes. Surprise maybe at the sheer physical mass of the Mercer brothers standing together. These were not men who were easily pushed. Hale addressed Corbin, correctly identifying the leader. He produced documents. He explained in smooth and reasonable tones that the railroad held territorial grants dating to 1867 that superseded the Mercers' homestead claim on Elk Creek. They were prepared to offer compensation for an easement. If compensation was not accepted, they would proceed with surveying and fencing within 10 days. He said all of this the way a man reads a menu, calmly, as if the destruction of their livelihood was simply one option among several. Corbin took the document and read it, and his jaw could have cut glass. His anger was cold, controlled, contained, pressure building behind a dam that had been built to hold. Boone took a step forward. His hand dropped to the knife on his belt. His anger was hot, immediate, a lit fuse looking for powder. The hired guns shifted their weight, and Clara stepped forward. "Mr. Hale?" Her voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Clean, precise, final. "I am Mrs. Mercer." The lie came automatically. She was not legally Mrs. Mercer. Not yet. But Hale did not know that. "You have delivered your message. We will review the documents and consult with our attorney." Everyone froze. Hale blinked, momentarily derailed from his rehearsed script. Boone stared at her. Corbin's head turned slowly the way a man's head turns when he hears a sound he cannot identify. "Your attorney," Hale repeated. "Yes, I assume you would not expect us to accept a claim of this magnitude without proper legal review." A beat of silence. Hale's smile returned colder, now recalculated. He handed the document to Clara. "Of course. Though the railroad begins surveying in 10 days with or without your cooperation." "Noted," Clara said. Her expression did not change. "Good day, Mr. Hale." He remounted, tipped his hat, rode off with his hired guns, leaving dust and the smell of expensive cologne and a silence so thick it had weight. Boone was the first to speak. "We do not have an attorney." "I know." "Then why did you say that?" "Because your brother was about to pull a knife on a man with 2 guns at his back. And because we need time to think at a funeral." Boone's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had no response to this. For the first time since Clara had arrived, Boone Mercer had nothing to say. Corbin took the document from Clara's hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. Really looked. And something passed between them that was not romance and was not gratitude and was not any single thing that could be named. It was recognition. The sudden, startling understanding that this woman was not what he had expected, not what he had prepared for, and possibly, improbably, exactly what they needed. "You are right," he said quietly. "We need time, and we need to find out if this document is real. Do you know anyone who understands land law?" Corbin glanced at Silas. "There is a man, Elias Crowfeather. His people have been in this valley longer than any deed or railroad. If anyone knows the old boundaries, it is him. Then we start there, Clara said. That night, Clara could not sleep. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, and Corbin was already there, sitting in the dark with a rifle across his knees, watching the valley by moonlight. Cannot sleep either, she asked. I keep watch most nights, habit. She sat on the porch step. The valley spread before them, silver and still. Elk Creek caught the moonlight and held it. You are not what I expected, Corbin said after a silence so long, Clara had begun to think the conversation was over. What did you expect? Someone quieter, more afraid. I am afraid. The admission surprised them both. It came out before she could catch it, true and raw and entirely unplanned. I am terrified. I am in a place I have never been, surrounded by people I do not know about, to fight a railroad company with no weapons except a forged piece of paper and whatever I can figure out before they come back. Then why did you step forward? Because someone had to, and because your brother was going to get himself killed. She paused, and in what came next was quieter, more honest, closer to the bone. And because this is the first place in 6 years that feels like it could be mine, I am not ready to lose it yet. Corbin was silent for a long time. The coyotes called somewhere in the darkness, lonely and wild. The wind moved through the cottonwoods and made them whisper. Sarah would have liked you, he said. The words landed softly, like snow falling on snow. Clara did not know what to say to them, so she said nothing. They sat together in the silence, watching the stars appear one by one, and Clara thought, this is what I came for. Not a husband, not a house. This, a place where the silence feels safe. Inside the house, Boone lay awake in the bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling, listening to the murmur of voices on the porch. He could not make out the words, but he could hear the rhythm, and the rhythm told him something that unsettled him profoundly. His brother was talking, really talking, more words in one evening than Boone had heard from Corbin in months. And the woman was the reason. He rolled over and faced the wall and told himself it was suspicion, that he did not trust her, that she was too calm, too capable, too perfectly suited to their needs to be genuine. But somewhere deeper, in a place he refused to look at, he knew the truth. It bothered him because it meant things were changing, and change in Boone Mercer's experience always took something away. In the barn loft, Silas slept with one ear open. He heard the porch conversation too, not the words, just the rhythm, two voices finding their cadence. He smiled in the dark and scratched behind the ear of the barn cat curled against his side. It is going to be all right, Duchess, he whispered. She is staying. The cat purred. Silas slept. The next morning, Clara had coffee ready before dawn, strong, black, the way she had noticed Corbin drank it. She had also made biscuits from the pantry flour, checking for weevils first, because she always checked for weevils and always would. She laid the railroad document on the table beside a page torn from her journal. Notes she had made during the night when sleep would not come, and her mind would not stop turning the problem over like a stone in her hands. Questions about the document's legitimacy. A timeline of territorial survey office establishment. Observations about dates that did not align. The three brothers gathered at the table and stared at her handwriting. Small, precise, meticulous. Every question numbered. Every observation referenced. You did this last night, Boone asked, and there was no skepticism in his voice. Only surprise. I could not sleep, so I read. Corbin picked up her notes, read them slowly, looked at her. You noticed the date discrepancy. The Territorial Surveyor's Office was not established until 1869. This document claims to be from 1867. Who issued a grant 2 years before the issuing office existed? Silence around the table. We need to see Elias, Corbin said. All of us, Clara said firmly. If this is a fight, it belongs to everyone at this table. Boone looked at her for a long moment. Something worked behind his eyes. Then slowly, reluctantly, like a door being opened against its own rusted hinges, he nodded. All right, he said. City girl, let us go see Elias. My name is Clara. Another pause. Then Boone's mouth did something it had not done in her presence before. It almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Close enough that Silas noticed it across the table and hid his own grin behind his coffee cup. Clara, Boone repeated. Fine, let us go. They began to prepare. Saddles, provisions, weapons. And then Silas, checking the barn, stopped cold. He crouched near the south wall and called out to his brothers, his voice carrying the particular tension of a man who has found something he was not looking for. Fresh hoofprints in the mud, multiple horses, none of them theirs. Someone had been here during the night, watching. Corbin and Boone exchanged a look that needed no words. A look born of years of reading each other's silence, of knowing that the worst things in life arrive without announcement. "We ride armed," Corbin said quietly. "Nobody goes anywhere alone." Clara stood in the barn doorway, looking at the hoof prints, then at the three brothers standing around her. A wall of muscle and determination and barely contained fury. She thought about the stagecoach she had ridden to get here, the letter she had carried against her heart, the woman she had been when she climbed down onto the boardwalk in Silver Falls just 8 days ago. That woman had been looking for a home. This woman was looking at a war. But she also thought with a certainty that surprised her with its fierceness, "At least I am not fighting it alone." They rode out at dawn, armed and watchful, four riders moving through country that grew wilder with every mile. Corbin led. Boone scouted ahead on his gray gelding, reading the trail with the same instinct. Clara brought to documents, seeing details invisible to untrained eyes. Every disturbed stone, every broken branch, every place where riders had passed, and how recently. He communicated these findings to Corbin in a terse shorthand that needed no explanation between them, a language developed over years of riding together, of surviving together. Clara watched this and recognized competence, the deep practice kind. Whatever Boone's feelings about her, he was excellent at what he did. This was a man she wanted on her side when trouble came. Clara rode Penny, a mare Silas had chosen for her temperament, and she sat the saddle with determination rather than grace. Her jaw set against the ache in her thighs and her spine straight as a fence post. Silas brought up the rear, watching the trail behind them with the quiet alertness of a man who knew that danger in these mountains could come from any direction. The trail climbed into high country where the ponderosa pines gave way to spruce, and the air thinned until each breath felt like a decision. Elk Creek fell away below them, narrowing as the valley constricted, and the three peaks loomed closer until Clara could see the snow on their upper ridges white against a sky so blue it seemed unreal. Corbin rode beside her for most of the morning, and something about the urgency of their situation loosened the bolts he kept tightened around himself. He talked. Not much by ordinary standards, but for Corbin Mercer, a man who rationed words the way a winter trapper rations salt, it was a flood. He told Clara about building the ranch, about felling the first trees with nothing but an axe and his brothers, and a stubbornness that bordered on insanity. He told her how the ranch had thrived under Sarah's hands, how she had turned raw survival into something that felt like living. He did not speak of Sarah with the raw, bleeding grief of a man still actively mourning. He spoke of her like someone describing an old scar, permanent but no longer open. Part of his body now carried everywhere, felt with every movement. "She made this place a home," he said, his eyes on the trail. "I built the walls. She filled them. When she died, the walls stayed up, but everything inside them went hollow." "It is worth saving," Clara said quietly. "With or without her memory, it is worth saving for itself." He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, she saw something in his amber eyes that was not grief, a spark, brief as a match struck in wind, but unmistakable. Halfway through the morning, Clara's horse stumbled on loose shale. She did not scream. She grabbed the mane with both hands, locked her legs, steadied Penny with a firm word, and kept going. Boone, riding ahead, happened to look back at exactly the right moment. He saw the whole thing, saw the calm, saw the steady hands, saw the refusal to ask for help. He said nothing. But later, when they stopped to water the horses at a mountain creek, he approached Clara for the first time without hostility in his posture. "You handle yourself well on a horse," he said, "for a city girl." "Thank you." She did not take the bait. "My mother was scared of horses. Fell off one, broke her collarbone. Never tried again. Everyone has their thing. Mine is not horses. It is paperwork." She held up the railroad document still wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag. "And right now, that is more useful than riding." Boone looked at her, and something shifted behind the scar and the suspicion. Not warmth, not yet, but a recalibration. The grudging acknowledgement that his initial assessment might require revision. Elias Crow-a-Feather's cabin stood in a narrow valley between two forested slopes tucked against the hillside, like something that had grown there rather than been built. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A vegetable garden going to seed for winter bordered a split-rail fence. Horses grazed in a corral and a dog barked once sharp and territorial, then went silent. A man stood on the porch with a rifle held loose in one hand. He was somewhere past 60, lean and weathered like a tree that had survived every storm by knowing exactly when to bend. Iron gray hair pulled back in a single braid. Dark eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be impressed by any of it. Corbin Mercer, Elias said, his voice dry as summer grass. Been a while. It has. Corbin dismounted and helped Clara down. This is Clara. She is with us. Elias's gaze moved to her, taking in everything in a single sweep. Her size, the way she met his eyes without flinching. The intelligence behind the exhaustion. He did not ask if she was Corbin's wife. He simply nodded and said, "Come inside." The document discovery happened at Elias's kitchen table over tea brewed in tin cups. Elias examined the railroad's claim with the patient attention of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the intentions of others through the words they put on paper. He found the discrepancy before Clara pointed it out. But it was Clara who articulated the legal argument that would become the foundation of everything that followed. If Elk Creek was designated tribal land in 1863 under a federal treaty, she said, leaning forward over the map Elias had spread across the table, a brittle hand-drawn thing preserved by his grandfather, with the foresight of a man who knew that promises written on paper were the only promises that had a chance of being kept. Then no territorial grant could override that protection. The railroad's document is not just fraudulent in its dating, it is constitutionally invalid. A territorial grant cannot supersede a federal treaty. Elias studied her over the rim of his cup. You think like someone who has had to fight for things, he said. I have. Good, you will need that. He gave them the 1863 map in a leather tube. Clara took it with both hands, feeling the weight of generations in the dried leather, and understood that she was holding something more valuable than any deed or dollar. She was holding proof, and proof she had learned in Boston was the only weapon that worked against men who believed their power made them untouchable. The ride back revealed that the ranch had been violated. The barn door hung open. Carved into the support beam near the entrance were words cut deep into the wood with a knife, 10 days, don't waste them. Below the words nailed to the timber, a surveyor's map with large sections of their property marked in red ink. Railroad easement. Boone's fury was volcanic. Corbin's was worse because it was silent cold, the kind of anger that builds pressure until something gives. Clara looked at the carved words and felt rage settle in her chest like an iron weight. They had been in her home. The home she had been building stitch by stitch and in scrubbed floor by scrubbed floor for 8 days. They had walked through it like it belonged to them. They want us angry, she said, and her voice was steady because steadiness was all she had. They want us to act without thinking. Instead, we are going to act with more thinking than they have ever encountered. Clara and Corbin rode to Carson Flats alone. 3 days east through country that changed from mountain meadow to scrub pine to high desert and back to forest so thick the sun barely reached the ground. They left Boone and Silas to guard the ranch because Clara argued and argued correctly that the property could not be left undefended while they were gone. Those 3 days on the trail stripped away whatever remained of formality between them. Not through words, through the small accumulating acts of care that build trust more surely than any promise. The first night Corbin insisted Clara take the bedroll. She argued. He refused with the immovable certainty of a man whose stubbornness was structural, built into the foundation of who he was. She fell asleep watching his silhouette against the fire rifle across his knees, keeping watch over her the way he had kept watch over everything he loved and lost and still could not stop protecting. She woke in the deep middle of the night to find him slumped against a tree, finally asleep despite himself. His breathing was deep and even, and in sleep his face lost the granite set of his jaw and became something younger, softer, closer to the man he had been before grief rewrote his features. Clara rose without sound. She added wood to the fire. She took the rifle from where it had slipped from his hands. She sat watch until dawn. When Corbin woke and found her there, sitting in the gray pre-dawn light, with the rifle across her knees and her eyes clear and watchful, something fundamental shifted in the way he looked at her. It was not romance. It was not gratitude. It was recognition. The understanding that this woman was his equal in the only way that mattered, she would not leave him unguarded. "You should have woken me," he said. "You should have slept in the first place." The Carson Flats land office was a narrow brick building staffed by a clerk who looked like he had been filed there, along with the records, and might remain until the building crumbled. He resisted, Clara persuaded. Not with charm which she had never relied on, but with logic so precise and implications so clearly stated that the clerk understood he was dealing with a woman who would not go away until she had what she came for. They found the proof. The original grant did not match the railroad's version. Different wording, different scope, different signature. The railroad's document was a forgery, and now they could prove it. Clara tucked the certified copy into her coat beside Elias's map and felt something settle inside her. Not triumph. Not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of having a weapon that works in a world where most weapons are denied to people like her. The ride home nearly killed them. 3 riders appeared on the trail behind them, rough-looking men whose faces suggested violence was a profession rather than a last resort. Clara recognized pursuit the way a hunted animal recognizes the shift in the wind. She told Corbin to leave the trail. He resisted. She insisted. "If we stay on this road, those men catch us. I will take my chances with weather over bullets." The storm hit as they climbed toward the high pass. Snow fell thick and wet, turning the world to white. The temperature plunged. The horses struggled on icy rock hooves, slipping sides heaving. Clara's hands went numb inside her gloves. Her face felt stripped raw by the wind. She could see nothing except Corbin's back, a dark shape in the whiteout, the only fixed point in a world that had lost all its edges. She focused on him, on keeping her horse moving, on not thinking about how easy it would be to simply stop. Corbin found the shepherd's hut by instinct or luck, or the kind of providence that sometimes keeps people alive when the mathematics of survival say they should be dead. A stone structure built into the hillside, barely standing, its door hanging crooked but dry. They stumbled inside with the horses, and Corbin kicked the door shut against the howling wind, and the sudden silence was so complete, and it felt like going deaf. He built a fire. She tended the horses, rubbing them down with dry cloth, making sure they had grain. They sat near the flames, close enough to share warmth, and ate cold hardtack in silence, while the storm battered the walls outside like something trying to get in. Clara wrapped herself in Sarah's quilt. Corbin watched her, and the firelight caught the silver in his hair, and the exhaustion in his eyes, and the raw, unguarded look of a man seeing something he had not expected and did not know how to name. "You brought the quilt," he said. It felt important. He did not argue. They sat in the firelight, and the silence and the storm raged outside and inside the hut. Something grew between them that was stronger than attraction and quieter than love. It was trust, the deep load-bearing kind, the kind that forms when 2 people survive something together and discover they are both still standing. They made it home on the 3rd day, descending from the snow line into autumn colors in familiar terrain with the desperate relief of survivors. Boone rode out to meet them a mile from the ranch, his gray gelding appearing on the ridge like a sentinel. His face was unreadable, but his posture carried something Clara had not seen in him before. Not tension, something closer to uncertainty. "Ranch is secure," he said, falling in beside Corbin. "But we have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that showed up 3 days ago with an axe and newspaper stuffed in his boots." Boone glanced at Clara. "Kid says he is family. Says his name is Whit Mercer. Rebecca's boy." Corbin reined in so sharply that Penny startled beside him. "Rebecca's boy." 15, thin as a fence rail, mother dead 3 months, stepfather threw him out. Boone's jaw worked. "Silas has been feeding him. I let him sleep in the barn." They rode the last mile in silence. When they reached the ranch, the house was warmer and cleaner than they had left it. The floor was swept. The dishes were washed. The chicken coop had new boards where rotten ones had been. And near the woodpile, a boy stood with an axe in his hands and an expression caught between hope and terror. Whit Mercer was 15 years old, rail thin, dark hair falling across a face that was all angles and hunger. Clothes held together by determination. Boots stuffed with newspaper. He set the axe down carefully when he saw Clara. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. "I have been trying to be useful. in case you decided to let me stay. Clara looked at the swept floor, the mended chicken coop, the firewood stacked with care. She looked at Corbin, who stood with his hat in his hands and his face full of a war. She recognized grief for a sister he had lost touch with, exhaustion from carrying one more weight when he was already drowning. She looked at Boone, who had let a strange boy sleep in the barn for 3 days without sending him away, and understood that this was the most Boone Mercer knew how to give. She made the decision the way she made every important decision. Quickly, clearly, without room for argument. He sleeps in the house. There is the room off the kitchen. It is small, but it is warm. Clara, Corbin started. He is 15. He is family. He sleeps inside. Whit looked between them with an expression Clara recognized in her bones. The desperate hope of someone who is prepared for rejection and cannot believe that someone is fighting for them to stay. She had worn that expression herself standing on a boardwalk in Silver Falls. In the days before the hearing, Clara and Silas rode to every ranch within half a day's reach. She sat at kitchen tables and spread documents beside coffee cups and spoke in the quiet, precise voice that carried more authority than any shout. At the Crawford Ranch, an old Roscoe Crawford had leaned forward over the papers and said, "They did this to you. They could do it to us." His wife Martha had nodded beside him, her weathered face tight with the anger of a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. At the Henderson place, the wife had been skeptical until Clara showed her the forged signature and walked her through the dates that did not align. At 2 ranches they were turned away. Fear of retaliation, fear of change, fear of standing up to men with more money and more guns. But enough said yes, and enough was all they needed. Corbin rode north with Boone making the same case to different faces. Whit stayed at the ranch guarding it with a shotgun Silas had taught him to use and a determination that made him look older than his 15 years. 2 nights before the scheduled hearing, Preston Hale rode to the ranch after dark. His smile was all teeth and his message was a knife. The hearing had been canceled. Judge Stone had ruled in the railroad's favor. Their petition was denied. Clara's blood went cold, then hot, then perfectly, dangerously still. "That is impossible," she said. "I am afraid it is quite possible, Mrs. Mercer." "Then you will not mind if we verify that with the court clerk." Something behind Hale's smile cracked. Just a hairline. Clara saw it and stored it and knew with the certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading the space between what people said and what they meant that he was lying. They rode to Silver Falls in the dead of night. All of them. Clara, Corbin, Boone, Silas, and Whit, because nobody was staying behind alone. Clara hammered on the court clerk's door until a disheveled man in a nightshirt appeared furious and bewildered. "Is there a ruling on file for Mercer versus Trans Mountain Railroad?" The clerk blinked, checked his records. No ruling, no order. The hearing was still scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning. Hale had lied. He had bet they would believe him. He had bet that a mail-order bride and 3 mountain ranchers would take a railroad man's word and give up without checking. He had bet wrong. The courthouse hearing was the moment Clara Whitfield stopped being a mail-order bride from Boston and became something else entirely. Something the town of Silver Falls had never seen and would not soon forget. They rode in as a group, 20 people. The Mercers, Whit Crow, Feather, and every rancher who had heard Clara's case and decided it mattered. They filled the street with dust and determination, and the people of Silver Falls came out onto the boardwalks to watch, whispering. Hale stood on the courthouse steps with his hired guns, and his face went white beneath its practiced tan when he saw them. "I told you the matter was settled," he said. "You lied." Clara replied, loud enough for every person on that street to hear. "The court clerk confirms there is no ruling on file. The hearing proceeds as scheduled." Judge Harlan Stone arrived at 10 o'clock and looked out over a courtroom so full the air itself felt compressed. Clara stood when he asked for the petitioner. She carried the documents to his bench and laid them out with the precision of a woman who had spent 6 years cutting patterns and knew that accuracy was the difference between something that held together and something that fell apart. "Your Honor," she said, "I am not an attorney, I am a seamstress, but I have spent my life comparing patterns, and I can tell you that these 2 documents do not match. One of them is not what it claims to be." She walked him through each discrepancy with the patience of a teacher and the exactness of a surgeon. The date 1867, 2 years before the issuing office existed. The signature Harrison Phelps, who did not take the position until 1869 while the actual surveyor was Edmund Cross. The scope, the original grant specified, limited seasonal water access, while the railroad's version claimed permanent easement rights. The treaty violation, Elk Creek was federally protected tribal land under the 1863 agreement, and no territorial grant could override a federal treaty. She spoke clearly enough for every rancher in the room to understand, and precisely enough that Stone could not dismiss her without dismissing the evidence itself. The courtroom held its breath. Stone's face went through several colors. Hale shouted objections. Clara stood her ground like Elk Creek against the rocks that tried to turn it. She did not move. She did not raise her voice. She let the facts do the work because facts, unlike men, do not need to shout to be heard. Stone called a recess. 30 minutes that felt like 30 years. In the hallway, Clara stood with the brothers around her. Corbin's hand found hers. Boone stood at the door watching Hale with predatory focus. Silas brought Clara a cup of water and stood close, a wall of quiet reassurance. Witt sat on a bench with his sketchbook drawing the courtroom scene because even at 15 he understood that some moments needed to be recorded. When they returned, Stone's ruling fell on the courtroom like a hammer. Stay of all railroad operations, federal investigation, cease all activity on disputed land. Clara felt Corbin's grip tighten around her fingers until her knuckles ached. Boone, standing behind her, placed his hand on her shoulder the first time he had voluntarily touched her, and the weight of it said everything his words never could. Silas breathed out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Witt grinned the grin of a boy who has just witnessed something miraculous and does not yet know how rare miracles are. An Elias Crow feather at the back of the courtroom nodded once. A small movement from a man who had spent 60 years watching promises made to his people, broken one by one. Today at least the truth held. That night, after the modest celebration at the ranch, after the Crawfords had gone home, and Witt had fallen asleep by the fire with his fiddle still in his hands, Clara found Corbin on the porch. Their porch. The place where they always ended up, as if some gravity neither of them could name, kept pulling them back to this spot. This view, this silence between them that was no longer uncomfortable but necessary. "We won," she said. "Did we? The ruling says we did. A stay is not a victory, it is a delay." He stared at the valley. Then he turned to her and his face was stripped of everything. No granite, no control. Just a man exhausted and awed looking at a woman he had not expected and could not look away from. "I did not do this," he said. "You did. The fraud, the documents, the arguments. I just stood there with a rifle looking useless. You chose me." Clara's voice was quiet, but it carried the way truth carries. Not loud, just undeniable. "You wrote that letter. You sent the fare. You stood beside me in that courtroom and held my hand when the ruling came. You trusted me to help when most men would not trust a woman with anything more complicated than laundry." "When did you stop being a stranger?" he asked, and his voice was rough, scraped raw by something he had been holding back for weeks. "I do not know. Somewhere between the stagecoach and the storm. Somewhere between the quilt and the courthouse." His hand came up, slow, careful. His fingers touched her cheek the way a man touches something he is afraid will disappear if he holds it too tightly. And Clara leaned into his palm, and the warmth of it undid something in her chest that had been locked tight since the day her father died. He kissed her then, softly, like a question he had been carrying for weeks and was finally brave enough to ask. And she answered. And the stars came out over the valley and the creek ran silver in the moonlight. And inside the house, Witt slept and the fire burned low. And the quilt Sarah had made lay folded on a chair. And everything that had been broken began slowly and quietly and with no fanfare at all to mend. The railroad did not accept defeat. Clara had known they would not, the same way she had known Hale was lying, the same way she had known to reach for the shears. Some knowledge lives in the body before it reaches the mind. Fence posts appeared along their property line, branded with the railroad mark planted in darkness by men who came and went like shadows. Cattle were scattered across 20 miles of open range. Armed riders patrolled the tree line in daylight, making no effort to hide, sending a message that required no words. Clara's response was the response she always gave to power that believed it was beyond accountability. She documented everything. Every fence post, every trespass, every boot print. Witt drew detailed sketches with a pencil he sharpened until it was barely an inch long, his careful hand recording the position of each new post relative to their property markers. Clara kept written logs with dates and times and descriptions so precise they read like legal depositions. Boone, in a transformation that surprised no one more than himself, photographed everything using a box camera borrowed from the Crawfords, learning to hold still long enough for the exposure with a patience he had never shown for anything else. They consolidated the cattle into the canyon pasture, a defensible position with rock walls on two sides and the creek running through its center. It meant giving up 3/4 of their range. It meant fewer cattle, less income, a harder winter. It went against every instinct the brothers possessed. But Clara's argument was the argument that always won because it was the argument that was right. We cannot win a range war. We do not have the numbers, but we can win a legal war if we stay alive long enough to fight it. Marshal Leland Reed rode in on a Tuesday afternoon, lean and badge pinned, and carrying the particular expression of a man who has seen enough of human nature to expect the worst while hoping for something better. He expected frightened homesteaders with a vague complaint and shaky evidence. He found Clara Whitfield. She presented 14 days of documentation with the methodical precision of a woman who had been preparing for this moment since the first fence post appeared on their land. Photographs, sketches, written logs, witness statements, the original fraud evidence, everything organized by date and incident type, cross-referenced and annotated in her small, precise handwriting. Reed sat back after 3 hours. This is the most thoroughly documented case I have seen in 20 years of law enforcement. His investigation took 4 days. Hale's own crew confessed to planting posts on Mercer land under direct orders. The forged grant was verified as fraudulent by the Territorial Surveyor's Office. The signature was fake. The dates were wrong. The seal came from a stamp that did not exist in 1867. Hale was arrested. The railroad faced federal charges. The Mercer's water rights were confirmed in perpetuity. A document arrived nailed to their barn door, stamped and sealed by the Territorial Land Office, and Clara held it in her hands and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Reed paused at the property line on his way out. He looked back at Clara standing on the porch with 3 mountain men and a 15-year-old boy arranged around her like a constellation around its brightest star. "Ma'am," he said, "if you ever decide to study law, you would make one hell of an attorney." Clara smiled. It was small private, the smile of a woman who had just discovered that the weapons she had been carrying her whole life, the reading and the noticing, and the refusal to accept lies dressed up as truth, were not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths that could change the course of a valley. "I am just a seamstress who reads too much," she said. "That," said Leland Reed, "is the most dangerous kind of person." The proposal came from the last person anyone expected. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of evening when the coal pressed against the windows and the fire in the hearth became the center of everything. Clara sat at the table mending a pair of Witt's trousers that had torn at the knee for the 3rd time because the boy was growing so fast his clothes could not keep up. Corbin was cleaning his rifle by the fire. Silas was whittling something that might have been a horse or might have been a tui, and Witt was doing mathematics problems Clara had written out for him, his tongue between his teeth and his pencil moving with the careful concentration of a boy who had discovered he was smart and was still surprised by it every time. Boone sat at the end of the table with a cup of coffee he had been holding for 20 minutes without drinking. He was watching his brother, watching Clara, watching the space between them that was filled with everything they felt and nothing they had said. Then Boone set his cup down with a sound that made everyone look up, and he said in the blunt and graceless manner that was the only way Boone Mercer knew how to say anything that mattered, "You going to ask her properly, or are we all just going to sit here pretending this is normal?" The silence that followed had physical weight. Clara's needle stopped mid-stitch. Corbin's hands went still on the rifle stock. Silas's knife paused on the wood. Witt looked up from his mathematics with the wide-eyed expression of a boy who has just realized the adults are about to do something interesting. "What?" Corbin said carefully. "You heard me?" Boone leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, and there was nothing hostile in the gesture. For the first time since Clara had known him, Boone Mercer looked not angry, not suspicious, not guarded, but absolutely certain. She came here because of an advertisement. You wrote the letter, she answered. You have been circling each other for 2 months like a pair of elk too proud to make the first move, and I am done watching it. Silas made a sound that he tried to disguise as a cough and failed entirely. Boone. Corbin's voice carried warning low and dangerous, the voice of the eldest brother, exerting authority he rarely needed to use because the threat of it was usually enough. I was wrong about her. Boone said it flat as a fence post, driven straight. Final. I was wrong and I am man enough to say it. She has earned her place here 10 times over. She saved this ranch. She built a legal case that a trained attorney could not have done better. She took in wit without blinking. She feeds us men's for us, fights for us. And she did all of it without asking for a single thing in return. He looked at Clara then, and his eyes, usually so carefully armored, were open in a way she had never seen. But she deserves more than a place, Corbin. She deserves to be chosen. Not because of an advertisement. Not because we needed a cook. Because you love her. And if you cannot see that you love her, then you are the only fool at this table. Nobody breathed. Corbin stood. His chair scraped back against the plank floor, and the sound was loud in the silence. He looked at Clara, and his amber eyes held something she had seen building for weeks, growing beneath the grief, like green shoots pushing through scorched earth. He had been afraid of it. She understood that now. He had been afraid that feeling something for her would betray the memory of the woman he had loved and lost, and the fear had kept him rooted to the spot, unable to move forward, unwilling to go back. Will you walk with me, he said, not a question exactly. More like the first honest sentence he had spoken in 2 years. They went to the porch, their porch, the place where every important truth between them had been spoken under stars and moonlight, and the vast indifferent beauty of mountains that did not care about human pain, but sheltered it anyway. Boone is not wrong, Corbin said after a silence that lasted long enough for the first stars to appear. About any of it. He rarely is. He is just usually louder about it. The ghost of a smile. Then it faded, and what replaced it was something Clara had never seen on his face. Vulnerability, the kind that costs a man everything to show and cannot be taken back once revealed. I wrote that advertisement because the ranch needed help, he said. I told myself that was all it was, practical, necessary. The way you fix a fence or shoe a horse, something that needed doing. He paused, his hands those enormous scarred hands that had built a ranch from nothing and held a dying wife and dug her grave in frozen ground, hung at his sides like they did not know what to do with themselves. But the truth is, I had been dying for 2 years, slowly, quietly, so my brothers would not notice, though they noticed anyway. And then you stepped off that stagecoach and you looked at me like I was worth looking at, and something inside me woke up. Something I thought Sarah took with her when she went. Corbin, let me finish. I love Sarah. I will always love Sarah. That will not change, and I will not pretend it will. But loving her does not mean I cannot love you. I think maybe it means I should, because Sarah would have wanted this house full of life. She would have hated what I turned it into, a place where a man sat in the dark and waited to stop breathing. He turned to face her, and the moonlight caught the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes and the raw, terrified honesty of a man who was choosing to feel something for the first time in 2 years, knowing that feeling meant risking loss and choosing it anyway. I am asking you to marry me, not as an arrangement, not as a contract, as a choice, my choice. I choose you, Clara Whitfield. I choose your sharp mind and your stubborn heart and the way you argue with Boone like you are not afraid of anything on this earth. I choose the coffee you make too strong and the garden you planted too late and the quilt you sleep under that was made by a woman you never met but somehow honor every day just by being here. I am afraid of plenty, Clara said, and her voice was thick with something she rarely allowed herself to feel. I just do not let it stop me. I know. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen in another person. Braver than anything I have done. Braver than building this ranch or fighting the railroad or any of it. She looked at him, this tall, broken, beautiful man who had reached across 1,000 miles of distance and loneliness, and pulled her out of a life of invisibility and given her a place where her mind was valued and her work mattered and her presence was wanted. Not for what she could provide, for who she was. Yes, she said, I choose you too. He kissed her the way he had kissed her the first time, soft and questioning, and then deeper, the way a man kisses when he has decided to stop being afraid of joy. And the door to the cabin closed softly behind them, and the stars continued their slow revolution overhead, and somewhere inside the house Silas laughed quietly, and Boone said nothing at all, which was his way of saying everything. They married in the spring when the valley was green, and Elk Creek ran high with snowmelt, and the three peaks stood against a sky so clean it looked like it had been washed overnight. The ceremony was held on the porch of Three Peaks Ranch, rebuilt now, the sagging corner leveled, the boards replaced wide enough for a family to stand together. A traveling preacher performed the service, a kind-faced man who rode a circuit through the mountain communities and had married more couples under open sky than under any roof. Elias Crowfeather stood as witness, his iron-gray braid over one shoulder and his dark eyes carrying something that looked like satisfaction. The Crawfords came, and the Hendersons and families from ranches Clara had visited during the railroad fight, people who had stood with them and now stood with them again for a different reason. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, deep green wool carefully stitched with details she did not need, but added anyway because they made her happy. She carried wildflowers that Whit had picked at dawn, his face solemn with the weight of responsibility. Corbin wore his best shirt and a look of quiet, incredulous joy, the face of a man who had walked through 2 years of darkness and emerged into light he had not believed existed anymore. Boone stood beside his brother as witness, and when the preacher asked if anyone objected, Boone caught Clara's eye and gave the slightest nod. No words, no sentiment. Just a nod that carried the full weight of everything he had put her through and everything she had survived and everything she had become in the doing of it. A nod that said, you are family now, and I will fight for you the way I fight for them. Silas cried. He did not try to hide it. Whit stood beside him, and at one point Silas put his arm around the boy's shoulders, and Whit leaned into it for just a moment before straightening and pretending it had not happened the way 15-year-old boys pretend about things that matter too much to acknowledge. When the preacher pronounced them married, Corbin kissed Clara like he had been waiting his whole life for permission. And the people gathered on that porch cheered, and the mountains echoed it back, and for one perfect evening, the valley was filled with music from Whit's fiddle and food from every kitchen within a day's ride, and the kind of happiness that comes not from ease, but from having earned every single moment of it. Summer came in hard, turning the valley golden and hot. The cattle fattened on good grass. Clara's garden, the one she had planted too late and tended too carefully, and believed in too stubbornly, produced more than she had dared hope. Tomatoes and squash and beans and kale that survived the early frost because Clara had covered each plant with cloth every evening and uncovered them every morning the way a woman tends to things she refuses to let die. The ranch settled into the kind of prosperity that comes not from wealth but from work honestly done by people who have something to prove and someone to prove it to. Clara kept the books. Corbin worked the cattle. Boone rode patrol with a vigilance that had shifted from suspicion of his own family to protection of it. Silas tended every living thing within reach and taught Whit to gentle horses and read tracks and understand the language the land spoke if you were quiet enough to listen. And then the black lacquered carriage came up the road. Garrett Ashford stepped out looking like he had been assembled from a catalog of expensive things. Silver hair, tailored suit, smile that had been practiced in mirrors until it achieved the precise calibration of warmth without sincerity. Behind him, 2 riders on horses that probably cost more than the Mercers' entire herd. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer. He removed his hat with a courtesy so polished it was almost aggressive. I represent a consortium of investors from Denver and San Francisco. We have been following your legal battle with considerable interest. We are not selling, Corbin said. I appreciate your directness, but I have not yet made my offer. Ashford produced documents from a leather case. $20,000 for the ranch, lock, stock, and barrel. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. $20,000. More money than Clara had seen in her lifetime. More than most ranchers would see in 10 lifetimes of breaking their backs against this beautiful, merciless land. She saw the impact register on each face around her, Corbin's jaw working as he processed what that money could mean. Boone's immediate fury at yet another outsider trying to take what was theirs. Silas's quiet sadness at the understanding that the world had found their valley and would not leave it alone. Whit's fear sharp and visceral of losing the only home he had ever chosen. "What would you do with it?" Clara asked, and her voice was the voice of the courtroom, calm and precise and giving away nothing. Ashford explained, "Luxury hunting resort, wealthy clients, authentic Western experience." He described it the way a man describes a paradise, conveniently omitting that paradise for some always means excellent for others. "By taking the water that every ranch downstream depends on," Clara said, "we would purchase easements. Fair market value. Everyone profits. Everyone profits except the people who built their lives here." Clara looked at Ashford with the same steady measuring gaze she had turned on Preston Hale and Judge Harlan Stone and every man who had ever assumed that power and money were the same thing. "You are offering us money to surrender what we just won the right to protect. I am offering you a choice." "No, you are offering us a price. Those are different things." Ashford left with his smile intact and his offer standing for 30 days and a parting threat dressed up as prophecy. After that, they would wish they had taken it. He was right about one thing. The weeks that followed proved it. Ashford's consortium moved through the valley like weather impossible to fight and impossible to ignore. They purchased the Brennan Ranch. Old Roscoe Crawford and Martha sold because Roscoe's health was failing, and Martha could not watch him die in the mountains when she had the means to save him. The Simmons place went. The Patterson homestead. 3 smaller properties Clara had not even known were for sale. Each sale brought surveyors and construction crews and signs advertising a future that had no room for the people who had built the present. Aspen Creek Luxury Resort, coming 1876. The ranchers who had stood with the Mercers came to explain, to apologize. They needed the money. Their children did not want to ranch. The offers were too generous to refuse. Clara listened without judgment, but each conversation was another cut, another piece of the valley she had fought for sliding away beneath her feet. Martha Crawford's visit was the one that nearly broke her. The old woman sat at Clara's kitchen table and held her coffee cup like an anchor, and said with red-rimmed eyes and a voice that shook, "I know we said we would stand together. I know what this means for you, but I cannot watch my husband die out here when I have the means to save him." Clara took her hand. "You do not owe us an apology. Family comes first. It always does." After Martha left, Clara stood at the window staring at the empty road and felt for the first time since arriving in this valley, the cold weight of defeat settling over her like the first snow of winter. Not the defeat of losing a fight. The defeat of winning one and discovering that winning was not enough. It was Whit who changed everything. He was sitting in the corner, working on his mathematics, quiet the way he was always quiet, when the adults were heavy with worry, absorbing everything and processing it through a mind that ran on numbers the way Elk Creek ran on gravity. He looked up from his paper and said, in the careful voice of a boy who has learned to test the weight of his words before releasing them, "What if we bought them back?" Every adult in the room turned to stare at him. "The ranches they purchased. What if we pooled money with families who want to stay and bought them back? Or formed partnerships? Let families keep ranching while investors provide backing that makes it sustainable." "We do not have that kind of money," Boone said, "but we know people who might." Whit's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape the way a creek grows stronger as tributaries join it. The general store owner in Silver Falls. He depends on ranchers as customers. A resort kills his business. The banker in Carson Flats. He respects what Clara did in the railroad case. Cattle buyers back east who want sustainable beef. The territorial governor who wrote those letters of introduction. Clara's mind caught fire. She saw it. Not just a counteroffer, but a structure. A cooperative. Multiple families pooling resources, sharing costs for equipment and breeding stock, and marketing negotiating as a collective instead of individuals picked off one by one. "He is right," she said, and her voice carried the same quality it had carried in the courtroom. Sharp, certain. The voice of a woman who has found the path through impossible terrain and will not be turned from it. Ashford's consortium is not the only one that can organize. and we have something they do not. What? Corbin asked. People who actually want to be here. They built it the way they had built everything else, with work and stubbornness and the refusal to accept that the way things were was the way things had to stay. Clara drafted proposals and partnership agreements and bylaws at the kitchen table by lamplight, writing until her hand cramped and her eyes blurred, and Corbin appeared behind her and set his hands on her shoulders and told her to rest. Corbin rode the valley talking to families. Boone provided security or riding to any ranch where Ashford's people were applying pressure, standing on porches with his arms crossed and his scar catching the light and his silence saying everything that needed to be said. Silas used his gift for connection, remembering birthdays and sick children and the names of every animal on every ranch he visited, building trust by instinct, with patience and consistency, and the unshakable belief that most living things would come around if you gave them enough time. Witt kept the books. He created economic projections that proved with the mathematical precision Clara had taught him that a cooperative of 8 ranches producing beef together could negotiate better prices, share equipment costs, and reduce individual risk by 40%. He sat across from skeptical ranchers and spread his figures on their kitchen tables and walked them through the numbers with a quiet confidence that made men 3 times his age listen. Elias Crow Feather came down from the mountains with connections to tribal councils interested in partnership agreements that respected both ranching and traditional land use. He sat at the Mercer table and read Clara's bylaws and said, "You have written something good, but it is missing something. The land. You have written about people and money and cattle, but you have not written about what you owe the land itself." Clara picked up her pen. "Tell me," he told her, "rotational grazing, resting fields, the relationship between water and grass and soil that his people had understood for centuries not as mystical wisdom, but as practical land management refined through generations of observation." Clara wrote it all down and the bylaws grew richer, and the cooperative's vision expanded from economic survival to something larger, something that honored not just the people who lived on the land, but the land itself. They called it the Elk Creek Cattlemen's Cooperative. 8 families joined initially, 3 more within weeks. By September, they had raised enough capital to buy back 2 ranches Ashford had already purchased, and the look on Ashford's face when he received the counteroffers was worth more than the money it cost. The first winter of the cooperative tested everything, not because of weather, but because learning to work as a collective instead of individuals required a different kind of strength than any of them were used to. Families who had been neighbors for years had to learn to compromise, to share resources, to trust each other with decisions that affected everyone. Clara found herself mediating disputes, drafting amendments to the bylaws, organizing meetings that went late into frozen nights. The hardest moment came when a blizzard cut off the Peterson Ranch for 4 days. Boone and Silas rode through the storm with a pack mule loaded with feed and medical supplies. They arrived half-frozen, exhausted, and found the Petersons' 3 children hungry and their mother sick with fever. Boone, who 6 months ago could not bring himself to say a civil word to Clara, sat up all night with Mrs. Peterson's youngest, a 2-year-old boy with a cough that rattled his small body like wind through loose boards. Silas tended the cattle. Witt, who had insisted on coming, despite Corbin's objections, cooked meals and kept the fire going with the steady competence of a man who had learned to take care of himself long before anyone else bothered to try. When they returned to 3 Peaks, Boone found Clara in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a long time before speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. Those families out there, the Petersons, the Hendersons, the ones we are trying to hold together. I ride to their porches, and I stand there with my arms crossed, and I look dangerous, and that is all I know how to do. I cannot write bylaws. I cannot run numbers. I cannot convince a frightened man to take a risk with words the way you can." He paused, and the effort of what came next was visible in the set of his shoulders as the way his scarred jaw tightened. "But last week, when those surveyors came to the Peterson Ranch and Mrs. Peterson was crying and her children were hiding behind the door, I did not just stand there. I sat down at her table and I told her it was going to be all right. And I meant it. I have never meant anything like that before." Clara studied him across the table. "You are changing, Boone." "I know." He said it like a man confessing to a disease. "And it scares the hell out of me." "Why?" Because the old Boone did not care about anyone outside this family. The old Boone could ride away from anything. This Boone sits up at night worrying about whether the Peterson kids have enough to eat. He looked at his hands, turning them over as if he did not recognize them. You did this. You came here and you started caring about everyone within 100 miles, and somehow you made me start caring too, and I do not know how to stop. Clara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. His fingers were rough and scarred and warm, and they closed around hers with a gentleness that would have been unimaginable from the man who had stood on a boardwalk in Silver Falls and looked at her like she was a mistake. You do not stop Boone. That is the whole point. On Christmas Eve, with snow deep in the valley and the house warm with firelight and the smell of bread Clara had baked and dried, apple pie, Whit had helped make. Corbin pulled Clara aside and said the thing he had been carrying since autumn. I want to do it again. Properly. Not because we need to, because I want to stand in front of the people who matter and say what I should have said the first time, that I choose you, not because of an advertisement, not because the ranch needed saving, because you are the woman I want beside me for whatever time we have, and I want every person in this valley to hear me say it. They renewed their vows in the spring on the same porch where they had first kissed and first fought and first admitted to each other that what they had built together was not an arrangement, but a life. Elias spoke words in his own language, first, then in English, blessing a union that had been forged in fire and tested by everything that should have broken it and instead made it stronger. Whit officiated the English portion, his young voice steady as he spoke words about love, being both choice and commitment, about building something lasting in a world that wanted everything to be temporary. Where he found those words, Clara never asked. She suspected they came from the same place his mathematics came from, some deep well of understanding that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with having survived enough loss to know what permanence was worth. Boone stood at the edge of the porch with his arms crossed and his face absolutely still, and when Corbin kissed Clara, Boone nodded once. Just once. The nod of a man who has accepted that change is not always lost, that some things that arrive uninvited turn out to be the things you needed most. Silas cried again. He still did not try to hide it. Nobody expected him to. It was one of the things they loved about him, his willingness to feel openly in a family, in a world that often treated feeling as weakness. It was not weakness. It was the opposite. It was the courage to be soft in a hard place, and it held the Mercer family together the way mortar holds stone. 2 years later, the Elk Creek Cattlemen's Cooperative included 43 families across 2 valleys. They had established a school, a shared community center, and a loan fund that helped young ranchers get started without drowning in debt. Ashford's resort limped along, but never achieved what he had promised investors. Wealthy clients came, but many of them preferred the authentic ranch experience offered by cooperative families, working alongside real people on real land, and some even invested in the cooperative itself. The railroad humbled and federally prosecuted, negotiated a legitimate easement agreement with the cooperative. Fair rates, limited access, fully documented. The relationship would never be warm, but it was legal and transparent, and that was enough. Judge Harlan Stone retired under pressure, his corruption finally catching up with him. His replacement was younger, fairer, and deeply committed to enforcing the law without checking first to see who was paying. Whit turned 17 and announced his intention to study agricultural economics at the Territorial College, then returned to manage the cooperative's expansion. You are sure, Clara asked him. You could do anything. Go anywhere. I know, he said, but this is what I want. You and Uncle Corbin and Boone and Silas showed me that fighting for what matters is not about winning every battle. It is about showing up every day and doing the work. I want to keep doing that work. On a warm evening in early June, nearly 2 years after Clara Whitfield stepped off a stagecoach into nothing, she stood on the porch of Three Peaks Ranch and watched the sunset behind the mountains that had given this place its name. Eagle Peak caught the last light and turned gold. Centennial held shadow on its eastern face. Old Woman Mountain, the smallest of the three, wore a crown of cloud that glowed pink and amber against the deepening sky. Corbin came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist, and the gesture was no longer tentative or questioning or afraid. It was the gesture of a man who had found his home not in a place, but in a person, and had the good sense to hold on. Silas sat on the porch steps, whittling something that was definitely a horse, this time his knife moving in smooth, practiced strokes. Boone leaned against the porch rail with a cup of coffee, watching the valley with eyes that no longer searched for threats. He had found something better to look for. He had found things worth protecting that were not in danger of being taken. Somewhere behind the barn, Whit played his fiddle, a new tune he had been working on for weeks. Something that started low and mournful and built into something brighter, the way a mountain morning builds from darkness through gray into gold. The melody drifted across the valley like a promise carrying to other porches where other families sat, families who had made the same choice to stay and fight and build something worth keeping. "You ever regret it?" Corbin asked, answering that advertisement. Clara thought about it honestly. She thought about Boston and the factory and the shears and the blood on the storm floor. She thought about the boarding house and the closed doors and the advertisement she had read by lamplight, the four words that had changed everything. Character valued above all else. She thought about the stagecoach and the mountains and the three men standing across a dirt street in Silver Falls, and the woman she had been when she stepped down onto the boardwalk with her battered trunk and her folded letter, and her absolute ignorance of what was waiting for her. "Every choice costs something," she said. "I gave up the possibility of a different life. Easier maybe, quieter certainly, but I gained this." She gestured to the valley, the ranch, the family gathered on the porch, the sound of Whit's fiddle carrying across the evening air. "I gained you, all of you, in the knowledge that I am worth fighting for. Not because someone told me, because I proved it to myself day after difficult day." "You always were," Corbin said. "I know that now, but knowing it and feeling it are different things. I needed this, the fight, the struggle, the proving, to finally feel what I had always known." He pulled her close. Boone raised his coffee cup in a silent salute. Silas smiled, the open, uncomplicated smile that had been the first kind thing Clara saw in Colorado and remained the truest. The stars came out one by one, mapping a sky that stretched endlessly above land that was finally undeniably theirs. Not because a deed said so, not because a court ruled it, because they had bled for it and built on it and refused to leave it, and that kind of ownership goes deeper than any paper. In the years that followed, people asked Clara how she did it, how a mail-order bride from a Boston factory ended up transforming a valley, how a failing ranch became the center of a thriving cooperative, how a family of broken strangers became whole. She always said the same thing: "I did not do anything extraordinary. I just showed up. Every day I showed up, and I refused to leave." It was the truth, not the whole truth. The whole truth included the sleepless nights and the bone-deep fear, and the moments when she wanted nothing more than to climb back onto a stagecoach and disappear into the anonymous safety of a city that did not care if she lived or died. But she stayed. She always stayed. And in the staying, she built something that lasted. On quiet evenings when work was done and the valley was peaceful, Clara stood on the porch they had rebuilt together and looked out at land that bore the marks of their labor and their sacrifice and their stubborn refusal to give up. She thought about the moment Corbin had looked at her across a dirt street in Silver Falls, looked at her like she was worth looking at, and how that single act of seeing had changed the entire course of her life, not because he saved her. She had never needed saving, but because he gave her a place to stand, and from that place she saved everything. The woman who stepped off that stagecoach was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her worth because she had fought for it, defended it, and built a life on the foundation of her own stubborn certainty that she deserved better than what the world had offered her. And she had better. She had everything. Not wealth or ease or comfort, but something more durable. Purpose. Partnership. The deep satisfaction of work that mattered done alongside people who mattered in a place that mattered. Somewhere in the building where the Elk Creek Cattlemen's Cooperative held its meetings, a photograph hung on the wall. Clara and Corbin on their porch, Boone and Silas flanking them, Whit grinning beside them with his fiddle tucked under his arm. 5 people who had come together by circumstance and stayed together by choice, looking at the camera with expressions of quiet satisfaction. Not smiling exactly, just present, solid, home. And beneath the photograph, a simple plaque carved in wood by hands that knew the difference between broken and ruined and had chosen every single day to fix what could be fixed and build what needed building. They stood their ground. We stand on it.